This is Podcast on the Brink, your weekly dose of Indiana University basketball discussion, hosted by Inside the Hall founder and editor, Alex Bozich. Since 2007, Inside the Hall has been trusted by IU fans across the globe to be the one-stop shop for IU basketball news, commentary, and analysis. Join us over at InsideTheHall.com. That's InsideTheHall.com.
Welcome back, everybody, to a new episode of Podcast on the Brink, and pleased to be joined for the first time. I look back in the archives. He joined us back in May, but Dr. Galen Clavio, the director of the National Sports Journalism Center at IU, also, this is how I first knew of him, one of the two co-hosts of CrimsonCast, the longest-standing IU podcast. Galen, welcome back to Podcast on the Brink. I wish it were better circumstances that I were welcoming you back to the show.
I always appreciate the chance to come on, Alex. Thanks for having me. I feel it's funny because you mentioned the CrimsonCast thing. Still have memories of the mid 2000s and getting on Inside the Hall for the first few times. And it's amazing how much has changed and how much hasn't changed at the same time in the 13 or 14 years since these things got started. I feel like we're back at the same spot again in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and one of the reasons I wanted to have you on this week, and I mentioned this to you before we hit record here, but I feel like we're to a point now where we've seen a pretty good sample size of Archie Miller as the coach at Indiana, and right now, objectively looking at this season, it was one where I said before the season that kind of the baseline, I think, expectation was to get into the tournament comfortably and give themselves a chance to advance. And you look at where we are right now. They're 12-11, 7-9 in Big Ten play, and the remaining three games are Michigan at home, at Michigan State, and Purdue on the road as well, a team that Archie Miller has not beaten as IU's head coach. So from a big picture perspective, I'm just curious I guess I'll start by first asking, are you surprised that we're to this point right now with this program, just kind of based on all the optimism that there was when Archie Miller was hired? And I think a lot of us will go back and say that when he was hired, it looked like a pretty solid hire based on who was out there, who was available, his credentials. But now, as we kind of wind down year 4 and head to the most crucial part of the season, it kind of feels like there's a lot of cracks in the foundation, and those may never be patched up.
Yeah, I'm very surprised that we're at the spot that we're at, not just in the macro of the 4 years, but even within the confines of this season. I think that each of the first 3 years, I certainly found myself on my podcast justifying or rationalizing why things hadn't gone better. And, the first year it was, it's none of his players. And the second year it was, there were injuries and still not the commitment to defense, but that's certainly going to get better. And then last year, it was many of those similar things. Again, I think there were fewer excuses last year, but the idea was, okay, fine. Even in the Crean era, the third year should have gone better than it did. It didn't, but everything meshed in the fourth year. So I'm sure that's what's going to happen here. And all the metrics look like they were pointed in the right direction. You look at the, Ken Pom, both offense and defense were gradually getting better. And it just feels like they hit a wall this year. And I would say there's nothing about this season that you can really point to and say the team is significantly better than they were the last couple of years. Even if you want to look at some of the metrics and say, they're playing better on offense than we might have expected, they're not winning the games. And that's ultimately what it comes down to. And so, yes, I'm surprised. And I think especially in relation to the other teams, the other programs that have hired coaches during this time period. It's not just that the Miller era has been a struggle at IU. It's that Brad Underwood's gotten Illinois going again, and they were arguably in worse shape than Indiana. Chris Holtman's moved Ohio State up to a next level. Steve Peichel has made Rutgers into a perennial tournament caliber team. And, to look at all of those things and then look at what's happened with the Miller era, it's head scratching, it's disappointing, and it's almost to the point where it's hard to explain because it shouldn't have gone this way. Like, I think I saw, it might have been Jeff Borzello or somebody else tweeted out the other day. It's like the Miller situation just proves we really don't know anything about head coach hires, because on paper, and people tend to forget this was by far the most sought after coaching candidate during that cycle. It was the guy that everybody pointed to and said, this is the next star. And for what I'm sure is a variety of reasons that we don't know about, it just hasn't happened.
I think the most surprising thing for me is talking about this season specifically is the regression that we've seen defensively in Big Ten play. This team started out, they were 5-2 in non-conference play. You kind of throw two of those out because they were, worthless games against, middling teams, but they're 3-2 against high major teams coming into conference play. They, obviously have a tough loss at Florida State, a game that really could have gone either way, and then the Texas game. But the one thing you kind of looked at from those performances overall was that defensively, Indiana seemed to be a pretty good team. I mean, they were hitting all the, you like to look at, do they hold a team under 1 point per possession? They were doing that often. And as we've gotten into kind of the meat of the Big Ten schedule, kind of the inconsistencies. I mean, I know they've had the two games against Iowa where they've been really good, but overall defensively to be 11th in the conference, when we were kind of sold, when Archie Miller was hired, that he was going to kind of build this identity based on defense and the pack line. And I think people were a little bit willing to forgive some of the early games under Miller where, Indiana State and Fort Wayne came in and hit all these threes. But then the other night, what we saw against Rutgers was, a defense that's still incredibly susceptible to getting destroyed really from the perimeter. Rutgers was coming into that game very cold from the perimeter over a pretty sustained period. And they come out against Indiana, and late in the first half, they just bury the Hoosiers by hitting 7 of 8 threes to close the half. So defensively, to me, I think is the biggest disappointment. From watching these games, I mean, you've watched IU basketball longer than I have, and you've seen a ton of games going back to Knight and all of the coaches since. Defensively, I guess when you watch Indiana, do you see it more as a effort thing? Do you see it as a scheme thing, or is it a combination of both? I kind of felt like with Michigan State and Rutgers was the first time I watched them in the second half and said, these guys might be checking out a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a combination of both scheme and effort. It's a complicated scheme. We talked about that the first year. The defense wasn't very good in the first year, but the explanation was, well, the pack line defense, it has to be instinctive, that where you're supposed to be, where your teammates are supposed to be, and you're recovering to spots on the floor. And it was, I think, the biggest surprise to me this year was how difficult Indiana, started to find that process. But part of the issue is that, from a scheme perspective, Indiana relies on older players knowing what they're supposed to do defensively. But those older players haven't been scoring, haven't been making things happen on offense, which means you have to play younger players who are then not capable of effectively playing in the defensive system. So it's this feedback loop that just ends up creating problems. But I think that the effort part has been the bigger issue, because you'll see Indiana play really good defense in stretches. 5-10 minutes. It happened with Rutgers. I mean, they were all over Rutgers. They were very aggressive. They were getting into passing lanes. They were bothering shots. And then things started to go bad on the offensive end, and they lost concentration on the defensive end. And again, it's this feedback loop that just ends up circling the drain for, however long they're in it. Earlier in the season, I felt like they were able to pull themselves out of that to some degree. Down the stretch here, particularly in these last couple of games, it hasn't happened. And so I think that, everybody wants to point the finger in one direction and say, oh, it's all the players' fault or it's all the coaching staff's fault. It's a combination here. I think that ultimately, if you're going to play this particular style of defense, you have to recruit really well. You have to get lucky with player development, and you have to be able to make sure that what you're doing on offense can support what you're trying to do on defense. And I just don't think that that's happened. But I also think the players haven't played up to par defensively. There have certainly been individual defensive performances that have been good. But I think as a whole, collectively, in what is a very collective type of defense, this group of players just hasn't been able to match up.
You mentioned the group of players collectively, but to me, I kind of watch the season and I look at what Trace Jackson Davis and Race Thompson have done, even without Joey Brunk there as kind of a backstop to give them any break. Those guys have played tremendous amount of minutes. They've been, for the most part, productive. Yeah. But I look at Indiana, in the backcourt and on the wing, and the inconsistencies there really kind of stand out, particularly with the upperclassmen guards, Rob Phinisee and Al Durham. And, I've been hesitant to criticize individual players because obviously these are college kids. They're not the ones being paid $3.5 or $4 million a year, but ultimately, I think in many ways winning at this level in college basketball is a guards game, and it's hard to have consistent performances when one game Rob Phinisee scoring 10 or 15 points, and then the next game he's afraid to shoot and doesn't take a shot the whole game. Same thing with Al Durham. He comes out the other night against Rutgers and is hitting everything, but you look at his game log and it's just kind of a mixed bag. I mean, how much do you think the guards specifically have been a problem in terms of the inconsistent results for Indiana?
I think that certainly that's the locus of the problem. And I think so much of the offense's inability to get going lies in the fact that there's just no consistency in the guard play. I think that the players you're talking about, Al's kind of an interesting case because Al is playing very similar to how he played last year. If you look at the numbers, right. I mean, his shooting from two is worse by a significant margin. And I think that's an artifact of the offense, not getting him good shots and forcing him to do a lot of shot fakes and drives and pull up long range jumpers. But I think across the board, he's turning the ball over a lot less. He's just not a consistent performer. I mean, his last 5 games, he scored 24 points, 7 points, 16 points, 4 points, and then 20 points. You just don't know what Al Durham you're going to get on a nightly basis. And unfortunately, for a guy that's playing over 30 minutes a game and essentially has for the whole Big Ten season, you have to have some level of contribution every single game if you're going to warrant those type of minutes. Rob Phinisee is I think a much more problematic situation. He just doesn't look like himself. And I think I was talking about this with one of my friends the other day. He's had a lot of potential throughout the course of his IU career, and he had the injury issues over the course of the first 2 seasons. But a lot of the projection of Rob Phinisee as, a starting caliber point guard at IU in the Big Ten has been it's all been based on potential. We haven't really seen it except in a couple of small spurts over the course of his career. And I don't think that he's necessarily to blame for that. But what you're seeing now is a player that just seems to lack any level of confidence in what he's doing on the floor. And I feel bad for him. I feel bad for the coaching staff because I'm sure they're seeing the same things, and it's hard to pull a player out of that kind of a funk. I've been trying to think if I can remember a player that's played as many minutes as Rob has in all the time I've watched IU that is just so obviously suffering from a crisis of confidence with seemingly no way of getting out of it. And I really have a hard time thinking of anybody that falls into that category. I mean, it's really just, it's a shame because, as promising as he was as a high school player, it just hasn't translated. And I almost feel like in the first couple of years that he was here, there were at least some other players that could help to compensate and take the load off. And that just hasn't happened this year. There's really nobody that can successfully push on the bench for those minutes. Christian Lander's still not there in areas of his game. And so Rob's out there on an island, and, he's continuing to get minutes because he has to, because there's not really a good option from a defensive perspective to replace what he does there. But offensively, he's essentially a non-contributor at this point. And that's a real disappointment. And I do think that ends up being part of the start of problems on every offensive possession, is that the opposing team at this point doesn't have to worry about him as an offensive option. And so that ends up creating problems for everybody else as well.
Yeah, I mean, you raised an excellent point in terms of his offensive struggles. I do think defensively, in a lot of cases, he's been pretty solid still. But when you have a player that's basically a shell of what he once was offensively, that, you know, the problem, last year with Indiana's team was they were really easy to guard in many ways because they played, essentially three bigs, and you didn't have to guard certain guys outside of 5 feet. This year is a little different. Their offense in Big Ten play has been respectable. I think good enough to win, but the inconsistencies I think really plague them on a game-to-game basis. And I think you make a really good point that there's really no other option to replace him on this roster. When you look at what Lander's done, there was high expectations on him coming in. I was pretty high on his ability. I still think long-term he can be a really good player, but defensively, he's a guy that, opposing defenses attack the minute they see him on the court. Like, it's almost like it's drilled into their head. If he's out there, whoever he's guarding, go at him immediately, and they usually score quickly. And offensively, you mentioned, a guy not being able to think of a guy whose confidence has eroded, maybe like Phinisee's, but I don't recall a guy going 1 of 17 on twos. That's just that statistic is just sticks out to me as amazing. What have you seen with Lander? I mean, at one point, I think there was a lot of people who wanted to say, all right, let's just go ahead and go young and put Lander out there. I don't necessarily think that would have been a great idea because I don't think it would have solved the problem. But at this point in the season, it feels like something's got to change or be some kind of shakeup has to occur for this team to maybe find its footing again, which I'm not predicting that's going to happen because I just don't see it. But is in any way Lander a solution going forward this season?
This season, it's hard to make an argument for it. I mean, his offensive rating is 65.7, which is a subterranean offensive rating. I mean, the minimum expectation you have for a player that's getting major minutes is that they have an offensive rating of 100. They're scoring essentially 1 point per possession used. And Lander is, I'd have to go back and hunt and find a player that got major minutes that had that bad of an offensive rating for IU.
It's interesting you say that because Ryan was doing that yesterday, Carraza. And I don't think he found anybody lower, but kind of in the same range. A couple of the names he gave me were, I want to say Daniel Moore was one of them, Donald Perry, and Ryan Tapak, who was a walk-on.
I mean, to give Evie as a comparison, a guy who played a lot more minutes and had a pretty bad offensive rating, Jeremiah Rivers, who, as everybody remembers, was not really very useful as far as scoring. He had an 81.7 offensive rating. And so you're talking about a player who is significantly worse than that in Lander in terms of being able to score. Look, I'll say this. You have to give Lander minutes if he's going to be part of the future solution for IU. And this is the problem. This is kind of the paradox I think that Archie Miller finds himself in right now, is that you took a player in who was a highly regarded recruit, but was essentially a year behind schedule from a physical and mental development standpoint because he skipped his senior year of high school. All of the struggles he's had so far this year, while unfortunate, were not unpredictable. And you now find yourself in a position where you can see flashes of the talent. You have to give him some opportunities, but you are really putting your team at a disadvantage by doing so, simply because while he does have occasional moments where he's able to contribute, it's going to have to be in smaller spurts, because the longer you play him from a minutes perspective, the likelier chance that you're going to lose points on both offense and defense from his inability to score or his inability to defend. And I'm with you in that, people say, well, just play the young guys and let's just get ready for next season. That's easy to say until you start losing game after game. And then it's like, well, wait, what are we doing? We still have a chance to get into the NCAA tournament. So it's really an unwinnable scenario if you're Archie Miller in that particular situation. And I think it's especially bad when you look at what's happened with the backcourt as a whole. Like, I think in an ideal setting, Rob Phinisee's playing somewhat to the level that we hope that we would see him play. Armaan Franklin's not battling leg injury and having to miss halves or miss games, and you're able to slide Lander into more comfortable situations where he's just coming in, playing 5 minutes, leaving, learning from that, and then moving on. And unfortunately, you've had to press him into a lot deeper action, and it just hasn't gone particularly well.
You mentioned, the prospect of making the NCAA tournament as kind of a reason not to go young at this point. Looking ahead at what's left on the schedule, and we have no idea what's going to happen, but I feel like, and I mentioned this to you before, this season and this program right now is a whole lot less about individual games, and it's a whole lot more about the big picture and kind of what's going to happen these next couple of weeks, because people have seen enough now that the next thing they want to see is making the tournament and advancing. Otherwise, if that doesn't happen, there's going to be a large segment of people who are tuning out, no longer care, or are pissed. I mean, take your pick of those three things, but that's a lot of people who are diehards that that follow the program. That's how they're going to feel. So, with what's left on the schedule and the Big Ten tournament, realistically, what do you think Indiana has to do to get back into the tournament? They're still showing up in mock brackets right now, but that's before what happens on Saturday and what happens next week. And I'm looking at this objectively, but they haven't beaten Purdue under Archie Miller. That's the final game of the season in West Lafayette. I'm not saying it's unwinnable, but it's unlikely. Tomorrow is Michigan, who is basically running through everybody like a buzzsaw. They're 17-1. They just crushed Iowa at home. They won at Ohio State. It's hard to see that game. And Michigan State is now all of a sudden, they got their get-right game in Bloomington, right? And now they've beaten Illinois and Ohio State, and they're back on the bubble. And they look like one of those teams that they could take Indiana's spot that potentially the Hoosiers were going to have. So what do you see as Indiana needing to do here? Do they need to win 2 of these 3 games? Do they need to go win 3 in the Big Ten tournament? What has to happen here for them to get in the tournament?
Hey, it's Jared. I'm going to jump in here real quick to talk about Home Field Apparel, our friends at homefieldapparel.com. And there are several reasons why you need to go to homefieldapparel.com to upgrade your Indiana University sports wardrobe. Number one, all of their materials are so comfortable. I have the hoodies. I have a crew neck sweatshirt. I just received my LEO t-shirt that they have. And all of the materials are so soft. It feels so good against your body. And what's nice is that they still feel soft even after you wash them. Because a lot of materials, you get them, you wash them, they don't feel as nice. Home Field Apparel stuff really does. So you can count on that. Plus, they have logos there that you're not going to find anywhere else. That's kind of their thing. They have over 90 different schools that they work with now. They go and find these old brand marks and logos and mascots that haven't been used in 40, 50 years, sometimes longer, and they bring them back. And so it's this great way to indulge your love of nostalgia, find these old logos that you haven't seen. And so when you go there, you'll be able to browse. I mean, for Indiana stuff, they have 2 pages worth of gear that you can see, stuff on t-shirts, stuff on crew necks, stuff on sweaters, such comfortable stuff. And it's not just IU. You may have people in your life that went to school somewhere else. Sorry for those folks, but they may have. And you can find so much gear for other schools as well. And even better, you can save when you go there because our promo code BRINK, BRINK, will help you save 20% on your entire order. So go to homefieldapparel.com, use that promo code BRINK, BRINK, and get 20% off your entire order. All right, back to the show.
I don't believe that there's ever been an at-large team in the tournament that was only 1 game above 500 on Selection Sunday. And that, to me, is the biggest issue for Indiana right now. Right now, they're 12-11. They've got these 3 games left. Under normal circumstances, I don't think they'd need to win all 3. I think they might even have gotten away with just winning 1. Two things have conspired against them. I think if they'd beaten Minnesota and Michigan State at home, at that point they would have been 13-9. And I don't know that they would have needed to win another game the way the schedule looked at that point, because even if they lost all of them, they would have had a chance, I think, going into the tournament or going to the Big Ten tournament at 13-12. But then that Michigan State game got added to the schedule, which means now if they lose the remainder of the games, they're going to be
12-14.
12-14. If they win one of the last two, they're only 13-13, which means they have to win at least one more game in the Big Ten tournament. And if they won one and then lost one, they'd be 500. They wouldn't be a game over 500. So it's actually that Michigan State ad, I think, really messed up Indiana's tournament chances, because when you couple that with the two losses that they suffered over the course of the last week, it left them in a position where they're going to be behind the eight ball unless they win these last three, which, again, as we've talked about, seems very unlikely. And so even if they did the unexpected and they beat two of the three, if they beat Michigan at home and then one at Purdue, if they lost that Michigan State game, they would still be in a pretty rough spot, because at 14-12, if they go into the Big Ten tournament and lose their first round game, they're right back where they were, even if without that set of outcomes. And so, I think at this point, that's the only scenario where I think they have a reasonable chance. They have to win two of the last three regular season games, and they have to hope that their strength of schedule, the sweep of Iowa, and the fact that they will have beaten either Purdue on the road or Michigan at home is enough to impress the committee. Because the other confounding factor that we need to keep in mind is, what happens if there are tournament upsets in the smaller conferences and you get an at-large team that's in, if Missouri Valley Conference gets an extra team in the tournament, or if if Gonzaga doesn't play in the West Coast Conference tournament and the West Coast Conference gets two instead of one. That's where those bids start to get taken away, and that's squarely where Indiana's at right now. So they have no margin for error as it is, and it's going to get even worse if you start seeing upsets in tournaments.
So now that I've given the audience the glass half full scenario as to where Indiana could potentially get if they take care of business, it's not out of the realm of possibilities. I think we'd be remiss to not talk about what happens if they don't make the tournament. And I think that's what's on a lot of people's mind. I'm not sure if you saw it. My dad wrote a column yesterday on WDRB. Greg Doyle's written a lot. I think, Zach Osterman the other night kind of wrote like a big picture type thing. And I've always kind of subscribed to the idea of let's let the whole season, I've got over 1,000 people on the message board. There's all kinds of ideas coming in at me all the time. I'm getting emails and getting tweets. And I've always kind of subscribed to this idea of let's let the season play out, and the results will happen, whatever they are, and then we can evaluate it. I'm finding it harder to instill that patience onto everybody because people can kind of see what's developing now. And so I'm just kind of curious what you think the plan is, I guess, from an IU perspective going forward if this doesn't work out in a tournament appearance this year, because to me, it seems that there's a lot of factors at play here. Obviously, there's a lot of money on the line in terms of what they owe to Archie Miller. There's a COVID-19 pandemic and the fact that they haven't had fans in the building all year and the uncertainty regarding budgets and everything. But then there's also the cloud hanging over. How long can you keep this going and keep the fan base engaged and excited about the product of IU basketball? And I feel like Scott Dolson, my interactions with him, he's always been a great guy. I think he's always going to put IU first. If there's not a more IU first guy than him that I know of, he's always going to make decisions that are in the best interest. But the spot that he's in right now is not one that I'm very envious of, because I just don't necessarily know that there's going to be a right decision at the end of this if things don't work out with this season, because there's a lot to unpack here, and I don't know kind of what the plan is moving forward. And it's an impossible question, I'm sure, for you to answer, but I'm just kind of curious for your thoughts on where this could be headed.
I think you could make compelling arguments either direction. And I've had many of these same conversations as you have with people who have wanted to talk to me about it. The argument for staying the course for another year is essentially partially financial, in that there is a significant buyout on Archie Miller's contract. It's a COVID year, and there are certainly financial pressures beyond just the normal, my God, we have to pay $10 million to fire a coach that's under contract. It's also, well, hey, we've got staff on furlough and we had no revenue coming in from tickets and things like that. I mean, those do matter. Now, there's also to some degree kind of a competitive argument in that is it going to materially be better or worse to try to make a change this year versus next year? Does it really matter in the big scheme of things? If you're, do you want to try to give it one more run around and see if maybe things get better? Maybe there have been certainly injuries this year that have contributed to some of the issues. And I think Archie Miller is well respected within the athletic department. I think he's well respected among boosters. It's not like the end of the Sampson or Crean eras, where I think with Sampson there was a real groundswell to get him out of there because people felt like the culture around Indiana basketball was changing for the worse. And I think under Crean had just alienated a lot of people over the course of the time as head coach. And so I think by the time it finally came around to make a change, it was an easy sell. I don't know if it's quite as easy of a sell here. And the flip side of all of that, though, is a couple of different things. One, you've got a basketball program that is not just stuck in neutral, but it's stuck in, we used to kind of joke about, people would talk about the end of the night era as being mediocrity. I think people would kill for that kind of mediocrity right now in terms of, being in the top 20 every year and being in the NCAA tournament as a single digit seed. Just being in the tournament period would be a blessing. But it's been 5 years now, spanning 2 coaches, since IU was in the tournament. And that's just, I want to say, as a longtime IU fan, as a season ticket holder of football and basketball, that's not acceptable. But that's essentially where Indiana is at this point. This is arguably, it's certainly the lowest ebb for the program since the late 60s, right before Bob Knight got hired. And I think you can make an argument there, it's as low of an ebb as you've ever really seen with IU basketball since it became serious about fielding winning basketball programs. And, there's a calculus there where you look at what happened at the beginning of the Crean era, and you had those really overmatched teams that didn't win very many games in the first 3 years. People still came back. And so, to some degree, I think there might be a situation where people say, we're certainly not happy about where things are, but we're not worried about permanently losing IU basketball fans because we know when the team is good that they'll come back again. But I think that's dangerous because you're losing a lot of people, not just donors, but young alumni, people in high school, people younger than that, for whom IU basketball is just not that special. It's just kind of something that's there. There's people that are far more excited about IU football right now than IU basketball, which I've been an IU football fan for decades. I never thought I'd see that happen. And so there is an apathy argument that is actually more problematic than any losses or any financial issues that might arise from doing something. If people are just completely checked out on the era and are actively getting depressed, not even actively getting depressed, but don't even care enough to turn on the games, aren't even checking in. I mean, that's been the thing that's been surprising to me. I've had a lot of people who have been longtime IU fans that I've talked to for years who have been like, oh yeah, I forgot that we played last night. Or I turned the game off, with 15 minutes left because it was obvious what was going to happen. That's a terrible spot for any program to be in, let alone Indiana. And, that's, I guess, the thing I keep coming back to is Indiana has had a tendency historically, and this stretches through multiple athletic departments, multiple university presidents, of waiting a couple of years too long to make changes when it was obvious that they needed to make a change. And I think that what has unfortunately separated IU from some of the blue bloods, as we would call them, is that they've been willing to kind of let things sit around for a while, whereas their competitors have tended to act very quickly. North Carolina under the Matt Doherty era, they didn't let that fester for particularly long. Kentucky under Billy Gillispie, they didn't let that go for very long. It's not to say that it's always a good idea to do that. UCLA has famously become, a revolving door of coaches, and they've never really quite gotten it going. I do think it's something to think about with IU, though. It's like you'll probably be fine long term as a program, regardless of what happens. But as we go into this offseason, there have to be some considerations as far as, do you have to make a change if you want to try to get back to a particular level? As you said, it's not an easy set of decisions. I don't think it's black and white one way or the other. And I don't envy Scott Dolson for what he's looking at as we move forward here.
Last thing I want to talk to you about, Galen, with, the last conversation we had was back in May, and I asked you about the campus at IU and everything that had been done from COVID-19 perspective and looking ahead to the fall. And I look at everything that has gone on. I've followed a lot of it pretty closely, and it seems like for the most part, Indiana has done a really good job in terms of bringing students back to campus safely. Having a mix of, I understand that a lot of classes are still mostly online at this time, but there's been some in-person instruction. But just kind of looking at the numbers and all of the things that Indiana did, overwhelmingly, I think people have looked at it as a positive. And I was, I guess happy to see the announcement recently that this fall, IU is going to be returning to in-person instruction. Just kind of, as someone as a faculty member, and you're obviously interacting with students a lot and different people at the university. I guess, what do you think has ultimately been the reason that Indiana's been as successful as it has, kind of in handling this? And are you 100% on board with the return this fall to in-person instruction?
That's a good set of questions, Alex. I've been very pleased overall with how IU handled this pretty much from the beginning. And certainly there have been individual things that you could criticize, but IU had a plan, and they put the plan together last summer. They executed it very well. I think their testing has gone very well. The way that they've handled individual flare-ups of things has worked out. And they've created an environment that has been, I think, cautious but effectively safe over the course of time. And, it's not been perfect by any means, but I look at what's happened at some other colleges and universities, and I look at what's happened at IU, and I'm proud to be a part of what's happened at IU. I'm very excited about coming back in person next year, and I think it's great that got announced, because I think there needed to be some direction given. Like essentially, here's the destination. This is where we're planning on being. I think that's helpful for students. I think students were planning on coming back anyway. I've talked to some folks in the rental markets here at IU, and they say that they've actually rented everything out significantly earlier than they rented out in a normal year for next year. So it tells me that people are excited to come back to campus. I think the campus has demonstrated that they know how to run safe environments for classes. And like you said, we've had some in-person classes. Most of them have been online, and that's been as much for faculty safety and faculty preference as it has been for students. But we've all kind of figured out how to make it work, and that's been really exciting. And we're starting to see sports come back now. Men's soccer and women's soccer just got started, and we've got baseball and softball getting ready to get going. I'm keeping my fingers crossed for Little Five that we might have that in some format later this spring. So, look, I think Aaron Carroll and the medical crew deserve a lot of credit. I think Michael McRobbie and Lauren Rubel deserve a lot of credit for, sticking with a plan and doing something that, essentially kind of allowed IU to shift right in the middle of the summer and still come up with an academic year that worked more often than it didn't. So I'm excited about next year. I hope that nothing untoward happens outside of our control that changes things. But I think we'll be in good shape and back on campus in fall.
Well, Galen, thanks for the time this afternoon. As I said, I wish it was under. I wish we were breaking down, potential destinations for the NCAA tournament. The 8 different pods that there were going to be, and everything's going to be in Indiana, which I think is going to be great for the state. I think it's going to be a fun tournament to watch. But from an IU perspective, to have the tournament in your backyard and to possibly not be a part of it, I think that's going to be another thing that's going to be a tough thing for a lot of people to follow. But like I said, I respect your work tremendously. CrimsonCast has been something that I've listened to for a long time. Really enjoy it. Listened to the episode yesterday with Scott and Tony. I encourage people to go check that one out. I know you were not a part of that, but fun conversation. And Galen, it's always good to see your face, even if it's virtually. Hopefully, maybe we'll get to do the Hoosier Hysteria Tailgate podcast next fall. Well, that would be awesome, right?
I am absolutely looking forward to that. I've already been plotting out when that would happen. It might happen during a football weekend because I think there's 2 home football games during that week. I'm already excited about that and having fans back on campus and so forth. And again, Alex, I appreciate you having me on, and obviously, big fan and supporter of Inside the Hall, and have enjoyed your work for a long time as well. So thank you again, and I'm looking forward to the next time we chat. Hopefully, again under more optimistic circumstances.
Well, thanks everybody for listening to Podcast on the Brink. As always, subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcast, Apple Podcasts, Spotify. We're all in all those places. Leave us a review if you like the show, and we'll be back once again next week, maybe after a win at Michigan State. We'll see. Who knows? Who knows what can happen in this IU season? It's been an up and down roller coaster, but we'll be here with you the rest of the way. Thanks everybody for listening, and we'll talk to you again next week.